who was very, very wealthy, had a poor man living next to him. And the poor man did have a family, didn't have very much. They had one lamb, but that lamb was not like the rich king's herds. That lamb was like your dog, like your cat. It was the family pet. They got him from the time he was little and kept him in the house and spent a lot of time and raised him and played with him. And the kids climbed up on little sheep and played. And one day the rich man had some company coming into town from out of town. And he said, I got to feed my guest. And he looked at his flocks and he said, I don't want to give up any of my flocks. And he sent some of his servants and said, give me the poor guy's sheep. And he took the poor guy's sheep and fed it to his guest. And this story was a story that was told to King David. You know, the guy that killed Goliath? And when King David heard this story, he was enraged. He was furious at the rich guy for stealing the poor guy's sheep. He said, he's going to die if I got anything to do with it. That guy's going to lose his life. But before he loses his life, he's going to repay him fourfold. He's going to give him back 4 sheep and he's going to die. David was mad. The man that told David that story was a man named Nathan. Nathan was a prophet sent from God to tell David that story. And David, after he finished his enragement, after hearing how could a rich guy take the only lamb, the little pet, the only thing he had, why couldn't he have taken it from his own flocks? He had multitudes to spare. David, after his anger burned hot and his pronouncement of death, that wasn't God's design. God's design wasn't for somebody to die for stealing. God's judgment was not dying for stealing somebody's pet, killing somebody's pet. That wasn't God's design. The repaying of it was, and the repaying beyond that was, but not death. David was hot and furious. And Nathan looked right back at David and said, You're that guy. You're that guy. He said, you're that guy. And then he went on to tell him how he was that guy. About a year earlier, kings were supposed to go into war and lead their troops into war, and David stayed home. David stayed home from battle, and while his troops were off at battle, David was up on his rooftop, and he could see into another man's home. That man was one of David's troops. He was gone at war, and as David looked down into that man's house, he saw that man's wife. And as the king, he said, I want her. She was taking a bath. He said, I want her. Bring her to me. He committed adultery, slept with her. Her name was Bathsheba. And word got back to David a short time later that Bathsheba was now pregnant. There was no way that Bathsheba could be pregnant from her own husband in that time period because of how long he had been gone off to war. And David knew that the guilt was going to catch up. So he calls her husband, Uriah, home from war. Wines and dines him, feeds him, says, go be with your wife tonight. I appreciate your service to our country. You're a good man. You're a hero. Thank you. And Uriah is so loyal to his brothers in arms in his country. He says, how could I dare go home to be with my wife when none of the other men can go be home with their wives? I will not. And he slept in the king's court, in the palace, on the porch. He wouldn't go in. And David finds out that he did not go back to Bathsheba, so he keeps him an extra day and gets him drunk. Gets him drunk. Says now he'll go back. Go back to your wife. Have a good time. Go spend time with her. Why? Because then he can pawn it off. That's it. It's not his child. It's Uriah's. It's Bathsheba's. It's not mine. And Uriah, even in his drunken state, still would not go back to his wife. He said, I cannot do this thing. Even in his drunken state, he was in somewhat of his right mind and said, I cannot do this. This is not right. And so David pulls out a pen and a piece of paper. And David begins to write on there, and he writes to Joab. Joab is the leader of David's army, the general. And he writes to the general, Joab, take Uriah and put him in the hottest part of the battle. And when it gets real hot, pull the troops back without letting Uriah know, and make sure he dies. He seals the letter up and hands it to Uriah, and has Uriah take it to Joab. He knows Uriah is so trustworthy that he won't open the letter because it's not to him. And so he's so confident in Uriah's trustworthiness that he sends Uriah's own death letter with him to Joab. And then Nathan, the prophet, when David says, kill the rich man, make him repay fourfold, Nathan says, you're the guy. You are it. You're the guilty one. It's a dangerous thing for a prophet to do. Really dangerous. There's lots of prophets. They were killed, stoned, sawn in half, thrown in pits, thrown in prison by kings that got mad at them. David had all the power, right? He could say, get me her. No one was going to say no. She's your right. No, they were going to. Yeah, right. You can have whoever you want. Just don't kill me, David. Nathan looked at him and said, you're guilty. This event had happened a year before. David lived with this for a year, and when it was brought up, he said, you're right. I am guilty. He had a past to overcome. This is going to be a 2-part message. I'm not sure if it's going to happen next week or not, but sometime in the next couple of weeks, part 2 will take place, overcoming the past. This morning we're going to deal with overcoming the past of your own sin. Of your own sin. We all got it. We all have things in our past that we did wrong that we have to deal with. Now, there's things that have happened in your past that you have to overcome that weren't because of your own personal sin. It was because somebody else did wrong. Somebody else wronged you. Somebody else hurt you. Somebody else did something bad against you. And it's caused great pain, and we're going to talk about that. Not today, but sometime in the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about that. Today we're going to talk about overcoming the past of our own sin, our own failures, our own mistakes, our own things that have caused us our own pain. The previous few weeks that I have preached, I talked about overcoming ourselves, right? Like we're our own biggest problem, right? Like most of the time it's not somebody else. Have other people hurt me? Have other people hurt you? Yeah, but most of the time it's us. We cause ourselves the greatest pain. Why? Because we're with ourselves all the time. I'm not with other people all the time. So I don't have the potential to hurt them as much as I have the potential to hurt myself. I live with my wife, but I don't see her all the time. I can never get away from me. I can never get away from me. And that is my biggest problem. I can tune God out. I can ignore God. But I'm with me all the time. And me causes me the most amount of problems. The problem is I can recognize that and I can adjust. And I can make corrections and I can make changes for the future. But what about what I did yesterday and last week and 5 years ago and 20 years ago? And for some of you, what did you do 40 and 50 years ago that haunts you, that hurt you? The mistakes and the sins of the past are there. And David, I think, is going to give us a roadmap for overcoming the past. I don't think any of you got David's record. Stole another guy's wife, killed him to cover it up, and wrote the death sentence for him and handed it to him. Okay, David, that's pretty bad. Right? I mean, we're kind of laughing, but that's pretty bad. What did David do? How did David respond? The story that I told you is in 1 Samuel chapter 12. The life of David is a fascinating, incredible read. Incredible highs to incredible lows to incredible highs to incredible lows. We're introduced to David killing a giant. We're introduced to David being anointed king of Israel. He kills Goliath. He's exalted in the king's house. He lives with King Saul. And then Saul begins to hunt